It was a bright and quiet morning in a small town where life moved slowly, and people started their days with a warm cup of coffee. The local diner sat at the corner of the main street, its glass windows glowing with sunlight. Inside, the air smelled of toast and fresh coffee, and the old jukebox played soft country tunes. It was a simple place where people came to talk, eat, and start their mornings. That morning, the door opened gently and a man walked in. He was in his late 60s, tall and calm, wearing a neat jacket and a cap with the Navy emblem stitched across the front. His steps were slow but steady, and his eyes carried stories of long journeys and years of service. He had served his country proudly, and now lived a quiet life, content with little things like a warm breakfast and peace of mind. He looked around for a place to sit and chose a small table by the window. He placed his cap on the table and smiled softly at the waitress passing by. She nodded but didn't come over. The man didn't mind. He had patience. He had learned patience from the sea, from long nights spent waiting for dawn to break over the water. Minutes passed. The waitress served others who had walked in after him. A couple laughed over pancakes, a group of workers chatted loudly over coffee, and yet no one came to take his order. He folded his hands and waited quietly. After a while, he gently raised his hand and said, "Ma'am, may I please get a cup of coffee?" The waitress paused. Her smile faded slightly as she looked toward the counter, where the manager stood wiping a glass. The manager gave her a look, short and sharp, the kind that needed no words. She hesitated, then turned back to him. "It might take a bit," she said awkwardly. "We're busy right now." He glanced around. The diner was not full. In fact, several tables were still empty. But he didn't argue. He simply nodded. "That's all right," he said softly. "I've waited longer for a lot less." There was quiet strength in his tone, the kind that came from years of discipline. He picked up the small menu on the table and read it slowly, though he already knew what he wanted. He just wanted to be treated like everyone else. That was all. A few people nearby noticed the exchange. A young man sitting by the counter frowned slightly, watching. An older couple glanced in the man's direction, then back at their food. No one said anything, but the air felt different now. There was a silence that didn't belong there. The man kept waiting. He didn't tap his fingers or sigh impatiently. Instead, he looked out the window. The morning sun hit the glass softly, and outside he could see people walking dogs, cars passing by, and the world going on as usual. Inside the diner, though, the air felt heavy. After a long while, he stood up and walked to the counter. He was polite, careful not to raise his voice. "I just wanted a cup of coffee," he said gently. "If you're too busy, I can come back another time." The manager looked up from behind the counter, his face stiff. "Sir," he said, "we're going to have to ask you to leave. We reserve the right to refuse service." The diner went silent. Forks stopped moving. Cups froze midair. The man blinked, not out of anger, but disbelief. "I'm sorry," he asked quietly. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just wanted breakfast." The manager didn't explain. He only crossed his arms and nodded toward the door. The waitress turned away, pretending to clean a table. The man took a slow breath, keeping his voice calm. "I served this country," he said softly. "But I guess service doesn't go both ways." He reached into his pocket, took out a few dollars, and placed them on the counter. "For the coffee I didn't get," he said. Then he put his cap back on, straightened his jacket, and turned toward the door. From the corner booth, someone muttered under their breath, "That's not right." Another person pulled out their phone and started recording. The quiet moment had turned into something different, something that would soon reach far beyond that little diner. As he reached for the door handle, a young woman from one of the back tables quickly stood up. She had been watching everything. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and rushed outside. She didn't know what she was going to do, only that she couldn't just sit and watch it happen. The man stepped outside too, breathing in the crisp morning air. The street was peaceful. He walked to a bench nearby and sat down, resting his hands on his knees. For a moment he stared at the cap in his hand, tracing the golden letters with his thumb. They reminded him of another time, of ships cutting through waves, of long nights under open skies, of brothers and sisters in uniform who had each other's backs no matter what. He sighed quietly. He wasn't angry. He had seen too much of life to waste it on anger, but deep inside there was a quiet ache, one that came not from what happened that morning, but from what it said about the world. Meanwhile, the young woman stood near the corner, her phone pressed to her ear. She spoke quickly, her voice trembling. "There's a Navy veteran here," she said. "They asked him to leave for no reason. He's just sitting outside now. Someone needs to know about this." Back inside the diner, people began whispering among themselves. A few looked ashamed. Some scrolled through their phones and realized that a video of the moment had already started spreading. One man quietly left money on his table and walked out. Another person told the waitress, "That wasn't right what you all did." The veteran sat quietly, unaware of the storm that was already forming around him. He didn't know that the world outside this small town was about to hear his story. He didn't know that people would soon stand up for him, the same way he once stood for them. He just sat there, calm and dignified, as the wind rustled through the trees and the sound of faint sirens began to echo in the distance. He looked up slightly, curious but not worried. Whatever was coming, he didn't expect it to be for him, but this time, it was. The street outside the diner stayed quiet for a while. The old Navy veteran sat on the bench, his cap resting on his knee, the sunlight glinting off the gold thread that spelled out the word he had lived by. Navy. He looked calm, but deep down there was a quiet sadness. He had faced storms at sea, but the silence after what had just happened felt heavier than any wave he had ever met. People passing by slowed down, some recognizing him, others just sensing something had happened. A few gave him polite nods, unsure what to say. The veteran simply smiled back and said, "Good morning." He never carried anger with him. He had learned long ago that anger was like an anchor. It only held you down. Inside the diner, the whispers had not stopped. The video that one customer recorded had already found its way online. It was short but powerful, a calm man being told to leave while others watched in silence. Within minutes, it began to spread through social media. People were sharing it with words like unbelievable and "this man deserves respect." The young woman who had made the call stood a few steps away from the bench, still holding her phone. She had spoken to someone from a local Navy group, explaining what she saw. They told her to stay there and promised that help was on the way. She kept glancing at the veteran, wondering if she should say something more. Finally, she walked over. "Sir," she said softly, "I called someone from the Navy. They know what happened. They're on their way." He looked up at her with gentle eyes and nodded slowly. "You didn't have to do that," he said kindly. "But thank you." "I just couldn't stand by and watch," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "You shouldn't have been treated like that." He gave a small smile, one filled with both gratitude and weariness. "Life's full of lessons," he said. "Sometimes they're hard to watch, sometimes they're hard to live." Back inside, the manager noticed people leaving without finishing their food. He frowned, not realizing how serious things had become. The waitress whispered, "People are filming. It's already online." The manager shrugged, pretending it didn't matter, but deep down he felt uneasy. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder, not fast and sharp, but steady, official. A few heads turned as several dark vehicles came down the street. They didn't look like police cars. They were Navy vehicles. When they stopped near the diner, doors opened and uniformed personnel stepped out. The young woman's eyes widened. "They actually came," she whispered. The veteran stood slowly, unsure what was happening. He thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but when the first officer walked toward him and saluted, he realized it wasn't. "Sir," the officer said firmly, "we heard what happened." The veteran looked surprised. "You didn't need to come all this way," he said quietly. The officer shook his head. "Sir, when one of our own is disrespected, we don't stay quiet." By now, a small crowd had gathered. People from nearby shops stepped outside, phones in hand, capturing what felt like a moment bigger than the town itself. The manager peeked through the diner's window, his face pale. The Navy officers didn't enter right away. They surrounded the veteran, greeting him with handshakes, pats on the shoulder, and words of respect. "We saw your service record," one said. "You gave this country decades of your life. You shouldn't have to stand out here." The veteran smiled faintly. "I've stood in worse places," he said. "But I appreciate you being here." The lead officer nodded, then looked toward the diner. "Would you join us for breakfast, sir?" "Inside?" The veteran hesitated. "Inside?" "Yes," the officer said. "That table you were denied, we'll take it together." The veteran took a deep breath. It wasn't pride that stopped him. It was humility. He didn't like causing a scene. But when he looked around at the faces, young sailors, bystanders, the woman who had called for help, he realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about respect. He nodded. "All right," he said softly. The door opened again, the same little bell ringing. But this time the sound was different. The veteran stepped in first, followed by a group of Navy personnel. The diner fell silent. The same people who had stared before now looked down at their plates. The waitress froze behind the counter. The manager stood stiff, his mouth slightly open. The officer walked up to the counter and said politely, "Table for all of us, please." The waitress nodded quickly, setting out plates and menus. The veteran sat in his old seat by the window. The sunlight hit his face, and for the first time that morning he smiled naturally. The other Navy members sat around him, filling the small diner with quiet strength. No one said a word at first. The sound of the coffee machine and silverware was the only thing breaking the silence. Finally, one of the younger sailors spoke up, smiling at the veteran. "Sir, we heard you were the reason a lot of us signed up." The veteran chuckled softly. "I didn't know I had that kind of power." "You do now," the sailor said with a grin. The manager approached, clearing his throat. "Sir, about earlier The officer raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but in calm control. "You don't need to say anything right now," he said. "Just understand something. This man wore the uniform that gives you the right to stand here today." The manager looked down, unable to respond. The veteran spoke up gently. "It's all right. Forgiveness is easier to carry than bitterness." He meant it too. He had seen enough of life to know that anger only burned those who held it. The group stayed for breakfast. The diner, once cold and quiet, now felt alive. People began to clap softly from other tables. Someone paid for the veteran's meal, another offered to take a picture. The veteran didn't want fame, but he understood the importance of the moment. When they finished, the Navy officers stood and saluted him once more. The veteran stood with them, returning the salute with a steady hand. The crowd outside applauded as they walked out together. The veteran turned to the young woman who had made the call. "You did something good today," he said warmly. She smiled shyly. "I just did what anyone should do." He looked at her kindly. "That's what I fought for. People who still do what's right even when no one else will." The Navy convoy eventually left, their engines humming low as they disappeared down the street. The veteran stayed for a moment, standing on the sidewalk. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the flag that hung outside the diner. He looked up at it and smiled. "Still worth it," he whispered. He placed his cap back on his head and began walking down the street, not as a man who had been refused service, but as someone who had reminded the world what respect truly means. By the next morning, the quiet town was no longer quiet. The video from the diner had spread far beyond what anyone imagined. It had been shared thousands of times overnight. People from across the country were commenting, calling the veteran a symbol of grace, patience, and dignity. News channels began running the clip, and soon the story had become a headline everywhere. At first, the veteran had no idea how big it had become. He didn't use social media much. His life was simple: morning walks, reading the newspaper, and tending to his small garden. He didn't even know the young woman's video had gone viral until a neighbor knocked on his door holding a phone and said, "You're all over the internet." He looked confused. "Me?" he asked with a light laugh. "What for?" The neighbor smiled. "For doing nothing wrong, that's what for." When the veteran finally watched the clip, he didn't say much. He only sighed softly. "I wasn't trying to make news," he said. "I was just trying to have breakfast." But to millions of people watching, it wasn't just about breakfast. It was about respect, about what it meant to honor those who served. Messages poured in from all over, people thanking him for his service, sharing their own stories and offering support. Some even sent letters and small gifts to his mailbox, though he never asked for any of it. Meanwhile, the diner's owner faced growing backlash. Reporters showed up asking questions the manager didn't want to answer. He tried to stay quiet, but silence only made things worse. A handwritten note appeared on the diner's door that read, "Closed until further notice." Despite all the noise, the veteran stayed calm. He didn't speak to reporters or make any public statements. When a local journalist managed to find him sitting on a park bench, he smiled politely and said, "Ma'am, I don't have much to say. "I just hope something good comes out of this." The journalist asked, "Do you feel angry about what happened?" He thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, anger doesn't build anything. I've seen enough anger in the world. I'd rather focus on what can change." As days passed, the story kept growing. Veterans from all branches began posting messages of support. Some shared photos of themselves in uniform with the caption, "We stand with him." The Navy also released an official statement acknowledging the incident, saying, "We honor all who serve. Respect is not optional, it's earned, and it's deserved." Those words touched people deeply. It wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a movement about kindness, dignity, and doing what's right. The young woman who made the call was also getting messages. People thanked her for standing up, saying that without her, no one would have known what happened. She told them she didn't do it for attention. "I just did what felt right," she said. He didn't deserve that. A few days later, the veteran received a letter from the local Navy base. It was an invitation. They wanted to honor him for his years of service and his calm strength in the face of disrespect. The letter read, "Your example reminds us what true service looks like." He was hesitant at first. He didn't like being the center of attention. But after some thought, he agreed to go. He wanted people to see that peace and respect were stronger than hate. When the day came, he put on a crisp shirt, polished his shoes, and gently placed his old Navy cap on his head. He looked at himself in the mirror and chuckled softly. "Didn't think I'd wear this again for something like this," he said to himself. The event was held at the Navy base's auditorium. Dozens of officers and veterans attended, along with community members who had heard his story. As he entered, people stood and clapped. He looked surprised, almost embarrassed, and waved his hand gently as if to say, "Please, sit down." The commanding officer stepped up to the podium and said, "We often talk about bravery on the battlefield, but there's another kind of bravery, the kind that shows patience when facing disrespect and dignity when faced with unfairness. Today we honor that kind of courage." The crowd applauded, and the veteran felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to praise. He had spent his whole life doing what needed to be done quietly, without expecting thanks. When it was his turn to speak, he walked slowly to the microphone. He didn't have any notes. He looked out at the faces in front of him and smiled. "I didn't plan for any of this," he began. "That morning I just wanted a meal. I wasn't looking for attention. But maybe this all happened to remind us of something simple, that respect doesn't cost anything, but it means everything." The room was silent. You could hear the soft hum of the lights above. He continued, "When I served in the Navy, I learned that we all come from different places, but once you put on that uniform, you're family. You look out for each other. Maybe we need to remember that again, not just in the Navy, but everywhere." He paused, his voice calm but steady. "I don't hold anger toward anyone. I just hope the next time someone sees a person who looks different, they see a story instead of a stranger." The audience stood and applauded again, some with tears in their eyes. The young woman who had made the call sat in the front row, wiping her eyes quietly. After the ceremony, the veteran was given a plaque as a symbol of appreciation. He didn't care much for awards, but he accepted it with a humble smile. He shook hands with young sailors, encouraging them to stay true to their values. "Service isn't just wearing the uniform," he told them. "It's how you treat people even when no one's watching." Later that evening, as the sun began to set, he walked along the harbor near the base. The water shimmered under the fading light, and he could hear the faint sound of waves brushing against the dock. For a moment, it felt like being back on the ship years ago, steady, calm, and full of purpose. He looked up at the flag waving above the base and smiled softly. "You still mean something to me," he whispered. He knew the noise would fade eventually, the cameras, the articles, the attention, but the message would stay. Somewhere, someone would think twice before acting unfairly. Somewhere, someone would stand up for what's right, just like that young woman did. As he walked home that night, the stars began to appear one by one. He felt lighter, almost at peace. The world could be unkind sometimes, but it also had people willing to make it better. And that, he thought, was worth more than any headline. The sound of sirens grew louder as the veteran slowly made his way toward the door. The people in the diner turned their heads, wondering what was happening outside. Through the large front windows, blue and white lights flashed against the walls, casting a strange glow over the place. The manager, who only moments ago looked proud and firm, suddenly grew uneasy. He stepped back, unsure if the noise had anything to do with what had just happened. But deep down, he already sensed that it did. The door swung open, and in walked two uniformed Navy officers, followed by several others. Their calm yet commanding presence filled the diner in an instant. Every person went silent, their eyes wide, forks and cups frozen in midair. The air felt heavy but also different, as if justice had just walked in. The lead officer scanned the room and quickly spotted the veteran standing near the exit. Without hesitation, he approached, came to attention, and saluted. The veteran looked surprised and took a small step back, not knowing what to say. The officer smiled gently and said, "Sir, we heard what happened. You don't have to leave. Not today, not ever." His voice was steady, but there was emotion behind it. The veteran looked around the room. Every face was watching him. Some were ashamed, some curious, and a few were on the verge of tears. The waitress, who had been too afraid to serve him before, looked down at the floor, wishing she could disappear. The manager, red-faced and nervous, stood frozen near the counter. "You came all the way here because of me?" the veteran asked quietly. The officer nodded. "When one of our own is treated unfairly, we stand with him. You wore this country's uniform. That means something to all of us." The veteran blinked slowly, trying to hold his emotions. He didn't expect anyone to show up, let alone people from the Navy. He had spent years believing that the world had moved on and forgotten what he and so many others had sacrificed. But now, standing in the middle of that small-town diner, surrounded by men and women in uniform, he realized he wasn't forgotten after all. The officer turned to the manager. "Sir," he said calmly, "this man has every right to sit here, enjoy a meal, and be treated with the same respect as anyone else. What you did today isn't just wrong, it's against everything he fought to protect." The manager opened his mouth but couldn't find any words. The weight of the room, the cameras still recording, and the quiet strength of the veteran made it impossible to defend his actions. He looked down, muttered something under his breath, and walked toward the kitchen. The veteran tried to speak but couldn't at first. His voice cracked slightly when he finally said, "I didn't want trouble. I just wanted breakfast." The officer smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's have breakfast, together." The Navy members took their seats beside the veteran. The waitress, now trembling but determined, walked up with a small notepad. She spoke softly, "What can I get you all?" The officer looked at her kindly and said, "Whatever this gentleman was going to order, and bring enough for everyone." As the food began to come out, the diner slowly changed. The silence turned into quiet conversation. People who had watched earlier without saying a word now came forward to apologize. A couple sitting near the window told the veteran how sorry they were for not stepping in. A young man who had been recording approached and said, "Sir, I'm posting this so people can see what really happened. The world needs to know." The veteran didn't say much. He just nodded and smiled softly, his eyes glistening. The scene was peaceful now, but filled with meaning. The Navy officers laughed with him, talked about their own service, and made him feel like he was home again. The tension that had filled the diner earlier was gone, replaced by warmth and respect. Outside, more people had gathered, curious about the flashing lights and the uniforms. Some recognized the veteran and began clapping when they saw him through the window. Others saluted quietly, understanding that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a moment that showed what unity really looked like. As the meal continued, the veteran shared a few stories from his time in service. He spoke about the sea, the long nights, and the friendships that got him through hard times. The officers listened closely, their respect growing with every word. They could feel the weight of his experience, the courage it took to live through what he had seen and still speak with kindness instead of anger. When the plates were cleared and the coffee cups refilled, one of the younger officers leaned forward. "Sir," he said, "you taught us something today. You reminded us what it means to wear this uniform, and to never forget the people who wore it before us." The veteran smiled and replied softly, "It means more than the uniform. It's about what's inside, respect, honor, and how you treat people. That's what stays when the uniform comes off." For a moment, the diner was completely silent again, but this time, not because of fear or awkwardness. It was a silence filled with admiration. Even the waitress, who had tears in her eyes, nodded as if she understood every word. Eventually, the group stood up to leave. The officers insisted on paying the bill, but the veteran shook his head and said, "No, this one's on me. I owe you all for reminding me that the world still has good people in it." As they stepped outside, the late morning sun bathed the parking lot in golden light. The Navy vehicles gleamed, and the small crowd outside watched in quiet respect. A few more veterans from town had shown up after seeing the video online, and they greeted the man with handshakes and salutes. The officer turned to him and said, "If you ever need anything, sir, you call us. The Navy always stands with its own." The veteran nodded, putting his cap back on. He looked at the group and then at the diner behind him. "Thank you," he said softly, "for showing up. For caring." The officer smiled. "You earned it, sir. Every bit of it." As the Navy vehicles drove away, the veteran stood for a while, watching the flags on their antennas wave in the wind. Inside the diner, people continued talking about what had just happened. The same place that had once turned him away now felt changed. A reminder that sometimes one act of courage can wake up a whole community. The veteran took a slow breath and walked to his car. Before getting in, he looked back one last time. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, respected, and proud again. He started the engine and drove off toward the coast, not knowing that his story was about to travel much farther than he ever imagined. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of the veteran's small apartment. He sat by the window with his cup of coffee, looking out at the quiet street below. The events from the diner felt like a dream, surreal, powerful, and somehow healing. His phone buzzed again and again. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just friends checking in. But when he finally looked, he saw hundreds of messages, missed calls, and notifications. The video from the diner had gone viral overnight. He clicked on one of the links. The headline read, "Navy stands up for veteran after diner discrimination." Below it was a photo of him standing beside the officers, hand on his cap, surrounded by people clapping. The comments were full of strangers thanking him for his service, praising his calmness, and calling him a symbol of dignity. The veteran smiled faintly, though he felt a bit overwhelmed. He had lived a quiet life since retirement, never seeking attention. But now people across the country were talking about him. As he sipped his coffee, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, the young woman who had made the call to the Navy was standing there holding a small box. She looked nervous but relieved. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said softly. "I just wanted to check on you." The veteran smiled warmly. "You're not bothering me at all. Come on in." She stepped inside, glancing around at the neat but simple home filled with old Navy photos and framed medals. She placed the box on the table. Inside was a folded newspaper, a thank you card, and a small plaque that read, "For service and strength." She explained, "Some of the people who saw the video wanted you to have this. They said you reminded them what real honor looks like." The veteran touched the plaque gently. "That's kind of them. But I didn't do anything special. I just wanted breakfast." She shook her head. "No, sir. You showed the world how to face hate with grace. That's not something everyone can do." He smiled again, humbled by her words. They sat and talked for a while. She told him how the moment she saw what happened, she couldn't stand by. "My dad served too," she said quietly. "He always told me to stand up for what's right, no matter how small the moment seems." The veteran nodded slowly. "Your dad raised you right," he said. "Sometimes it just takes one brave act to remind people of what's good." Later that week, the veteran received a call from the local Navy base. They invited him to speak at an event honoring veterans. At first, he hesitated. He had never liked the spotlight. But the officer on the line told him, "Sir, what you did inspired thousands. We'd be honored if you shared your story." After a long pause, he agreed. On the day of the ceremony, the hall was filled with Navy officers, local families, and young recruits in crisp uniforms. The veteran walked up to the podium slowly, wearing his old Navy cap. As he looked out at the faces in front of him, his heart felt full. He began speaking softly, but every word carried weight. "I didn't come here today to talk about what happened at that diner," he said. "I came here to talk about what it means to serve. Service isn't just about wearing a uniform or following orders. It's about what's in your heart. It's about respect for others, for yourself, and for the country you love." He paused and glanced around the room. "That day I was reminded that no matter how much the world changes, there are still people who believe in doing what's right. I saw the best of what this uniform stands for. not because of rules or ranks, but because of people who care. The audience was silent, listening closely. Some of the younger recruits looked deeply moved. The veteran continued, "I've learned that dignity doesn't come from how others treat you. It comes from how you carry yourself when the world isn't kind. You don't fight hate with hate. You stand taller and you let your character speak for you." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Some people stood clapping loudly while others wiped their eyes. The young woman who had helped him was in the front row, smiling proudly. The base commander came forward and presented him with a flag that had been flown over the base. "For your courage, your patience, and your example," the commander said. The veteran accepted it with both hands and bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll treasure this." After the ceremony, reporters surrounded him, asking questions about how he felt, what message he wanted to share, and what he thought of the public's reaction. He kept his answers short and humble. "I'm no hero," he said. "I just believe in respect. If my story helps someone choose kindness over anger, then that's enough for me." As the days passed, messages continued pouring in, from veterans, families, students, and even people overseas. They thanked him for his composure and strength. One message said, "You reminded me of my grandpa. He taught me to keep my head up no matter what." Another read, "You showed the world what real bravery looks like." The veteran read each one slowly, touched by how deeply people had connected with the story. Weeks later, he returned to the same diner. The place looked brighter, more welcoming. When he walked in, the same waitress came over immediately, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for how I acted before," she said. "We've all learned something because of you." The manager, too, came out from the kitchen and apologized sincerely. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "You showed me what real strength looks like." The veteran nodded and replied, "Apologies accepted. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." He sat at the same booth and ordered the same meal he had wanted that morning. This time it came quickly, with a warm smile from the waitress. The people in the diner greeted him kindly, some even asking to take pictures. He agreed politely but stayed humble, still just a man who wanted to enjoy breakfast in peace. As he ate, he looked out the window and saw the same young woman standing across the street. She waved and he smiled back. When he finished, he left a generous tip on the table and quietly walked outside. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. The veteran put on his navy cap and stood there for a moment, feeling the cool breeze on his face. He thought about everything that had happened, the anger, the support, the unity, and how it had all come together to create something bigger than him. A story of respect, a story of change. He walked toward the nearby pier where the waves moved gently against the wood. The sound reminded him of his days at sea. He stood there quietly, watching the horizon. The world felt peaceful again. He whispered softly to himself. It was all worth it. The waves rolled in and out, carrying his reflection in the fading light. For the first time in years, he felt fully at peace, with his past, with the world, and with himself.